Hello, everybody. I think we're live. Welcome. My name is Mr. Lagerway. I'm coming to you live from Holland, Michigan this evening, and we're here to talk about some APUSH on behalf of Fiveable. Welcome. We're talking about the USA's shift toward empire, so perhaps the beginning of period 7, if you folks are there yet. And we're talking about empire in a variety of ways. Before we get into that too much, just to make sure we're all sort of on the same page, got a couple of preliminary slides for you, let you know what's going on, what we're going to do in this stream. And during our stream tonight, we're going to be covering 4 main topics as well as questions and answers throughout. First of all, we're going to talk about reasons for imperialism. Why did it happen? What was the pros and cons, the pro-people, the anti-people? We're going to talk about the effects and events of imperialism themselves. We're going to talk about debates over imperialism, again, the anti and the pro-people, and this is going to be a little bit more in-depth there. And then we're also going to have a little bit of a PS on World War I. Imperialism, at least in APUSH, is often focusing on the 1890s, and the early 1900s, and we'll focus mostly on that era. But World War I also fits in a little bit. Obviously, we're going to be covering World War I a little bit later with the progressive stream that's happening next week, but a little bit of World War I this week that we need to be covering. And we'll end with some question and answers, so hopefully you'll be able to get your questions answered, and just feel free to ask those along as we go. So just to make sure you're able to hear me and this is working out okay, and to give a sense of how we're doing, if you could drop something in the chat that lets me know how you're feeling about imperialism. You could do one of those 1 to 5. I don't know what's going on with imperialism. I've never heard of it before. Or 5 meaning like, I got this. I could tell you all about the Roosevelt Corollary and you're all set to go. Otherwise, feel free to just say hi. But giving us a quick 1 to 5 is really helpful just to get a sense of where we need to go with the stream and how I can best help you out. So feel free to do that now. A-Dog says, oh yeah, 2. All right. So we're just getting an introduction. That's good. We got a 3 out of 5 from Ronald. All right. Sounds good. Some other people chiming in perhaps. Just, again, be aware that we have people that are at different points in their class and different points in their understanding. So our goal here is to kind of help you out no matter where you are. If you've covered this before, if you haven't, we'll hopefully be able to get you something new. So let's dive in. First of all, a little bit of geography that we need to be aware of, and this is one political cartoon that I thought I could find to be able to talk about a little bit this. Keep in mind that Cuba, although not on this cartoon itself, Cuba is going to be right here off the Florida coast. It's just below the United States, and then Puerto Rico is an island that's a little bit to the right. You skip over Dominican Republic and Haiti, and you get to Puerto Rico. Hawaii is in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That'd be that one right there. We also have the Philippines. Philippines are going to be right over here, and Philippines are very, very close to China. We'll see that in a variety of cartoons too. Hi, Ethan. Good to see you. Guam is going to be right near the Philippines as well. It's another small island in the Pacific Ocean. Puerto Rico, we already mentioned, and then Latin America is basically Central and South America. You just need to know those terms because we're going to be referring to those a couple times tonight. So knowing approximately where they are is a good idea, just so you don't get too lost, and so you can interpret political cartoons as we go. So let's talk some reasons for imperialism. Imperialism, remember, let me go back just a second. Imperialism is very similar to manifest destiny. In fact, APUSH is going to explicitly expect you to connect this 1890s expansion imperialism to manifest destiny. A lot of similar reasons, and remember, they're not just driven by one particular motive. So just like manifest destiny, so in imperialism, and our first example would be economic. So manifest destiny wanted to move west, get more farmland on the North American continent. So too imperialism is going to want to move continuously westward, a little bit of southward as well. And there's a desire for access to markets. Keep in mind, the United States has just gotten out of the Gilded Age, and it's still in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. It's producing lots and lots of industrial goods. It wants someplace to sell them, and there aren't enough Americans with enough buying power to be able to buy all these goods. And so they need to get access to places like China that can hopefully buy, with their 300 million people, plenty of American goods, thus helping out American businesses. So a lot of this is going to come from business owners who are going to be really excited about this. So there's an economic motive. One more piece of the economic motive that we're going to see in a couple more cartoons is that the United States desires what are called coaling stations or refueling points for their steam-powered Navy and their steam-powered ships. Because in order to trade, you have to have ships. Those ships need to be able to stop every so often and refuel. So this is going to lead to all sorts of things like taking over the Panama Canal so they can get around South America really quickly. This is going to lead to wanting all of these islands that seem to be in the middle of nowhere but are really handy refueling points on the way from the United States to the Panama Canal, that would be Cuba and Puerto Rico, or from the United States on its way to China, that would be Guam, Philippines, Hawaii, Midway Island, other ones like that too. Plus the added bonus of bird poop, otherwise known as guano. This was a really big deal during the time. In fact, the United States passed something called the Guano Act, so that way they could harvest bird poop from a lot of these islands that they claimed because it was useful for fertilizer. It had a lot of nitrogen in it. And it was also useful for making explosives and ammunition. So the United States is seeking some raw materials, mostly just access to selling things overseas. We'll come back to that a little bit more with China and the open door note. But be aware that the United States wants to trade, it wants to protect its trade, and it wants to be able to sell things to China. Yeah, Ronald, mine too. The Guano Islands Act, basically the Bird Poop Act. They're like, let's pass a whole law. That's how important it was, which is pretty cool. By the way, if you're looking for an interesting book about this, and sorry to be that nerdy APUSH teacher who always recommends books to people, but How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr is fantastic. It came out last year, and it talks about all the small little parts of the United States that are still territories or insular territories. And it's fascinating. It talks a lot about the Guano Act. So in case you want to read more about bird poop, feel free. So there's an economic motive to this whole thing. We also have cultural. The United States, remember, at this point is still highly racist. And the United States, I mean, obviously still today is dealing with a lot of racism. But back then, this was a huge deal. This was coming in the middle of things like the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 against the Native Americans. There was all kinds of discrimination happening against African Americans down south. 1896, just 2 years before the Spanish-American War, is Plessy v. Ferguson. Thus, we're at this racial nadir, this racial low point with lots of segregation and all sorts of racial violence not too far behind us in Reconstruction and afterwards, lynching going on, etc. So there's a lot of racism, and that plays into this cultural idea, and that is social Darwinism. Remember, Darwin publishes The Origin of the Species a few decades earlier. This is applying the idea of survival of the fittest, of evolution. Social Darwinism takes that, removes it from the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom, and applies it to humanity, which is a bit of a problem because it turns out that humans are treating each other as less than and not equal, and there's all sorts of racism involved there. The United States at the time is obsessed with Anglo-Saxon white supremacy. Anglo-Saxon meaning the super, super white, super, super Protestant, northern Western European peoples from Scandinavia, Netherlands, England, etc. And they think that they are the best and they deserve to spread civilization. So just like Manifest Destiny was civilizing the Native Americans, so too imperialism might be seen as civilizing some of the natives of other places. By the way, an official quick trigger warning here. We're going to see plenty of really offensive and racist cartoons today because not only is this the golden age of racism, it's also the golden age of political cartoons. And so there's a lot of really well done political cartoons. They're not necessarily good because they're super racist, but they're very, very useful. And I can almost guarantee you're going to see at least one of these on a test, on an exam, on the APUSH exam itself. They've used them before. So these are really important and it's good for you to be able to decode them. But just be aware that a lot of them have incredibly racially offensive stereotypes, depictions, etc. And obviously that's not condoned by any of us nowadays, but in order to get an idea of what it was like back then, we need to be aware of that. Third reason, political. The United States realizes that they're not the only ones trying to carve out empires for themselves. In fact, if you've taken AP World or studied world history in some other sort of way, you know that the United States is expanding just at the time that the scramble for Africa is happening after the Berlin Conference. And there's a whole bunch of people taking over Africa, taking over Asia. The European powers are expanding like crazy during this second wave of imperialism. First wave was taking over the Americas. And the United States fears two things. One, we're going to get left behind. We're going to fall out of the line of march, says Henry Cabot Lodge. So we need to make sure that we continue to keep up with the European nations. And two, connected to kind of that cultural thing, we think that we, as the United States, are the best to rule over other people. So should we leave the Philippines alone? Well, no, then the Germans might take over. That'd be even worse for them. So we better be in charge. So there's some compassion for helping out the natives, but there's also this idea of competition with Europeans. Lastly, there's this just plain idea of expansion. Remember, the frontier officially closes in 1890, even though it turns out it's not quite done yet. But after 1890, Americans start to worry, where do we go? Where do we find this line of the frontier between manliness or civilization and barbarism where we can forge manliness? People like Teddy Roosevelt are obsessed with this idea of manliness going out west, wrestling a bear in the morning, having tea in the afternoon, shooting an Indian at night, and yet going to church on Sunday, right? It's this really, really messed up idea of what it means to be a real man. And there's definitely some toxic masculinity going on right there. But the United States worries we're going to get all soft and too fancy. And so we need to have some place to conquer, some place to prove our mettle besides just the football arena. And so we're going to go overseas and subdue some natives in sort of a classic manly fashion. So be aware of some of those. And also, I'm going to show you some examples of that in some cartoons as we go. Before we get there, just one more way to think about this whole thing. As I mentioned, there's this whole idea of evolution coming around from Charles Darwin, and just the idea of progress in general, that it constantly is getting better. The United States thinks it has the authority to rule over all of these places because it is the best, and it's the pinnacle, it's the top of all of these four characteristics. So you'll notice over here, the United States thinks it has the best form of government. It's a democracy. It thinks it has the best form of religion. It's Protestant. It is the most manly, and it's the whitest. It's sort of like the United States thinks of itself as an adult. It thinks of Spain as maybe like an 11-year-old, and Cuba and the Philippines as these babies. You wouldn't put an 11-year-old in charge of babies, even though they're a little bit older. Spain has a monarchy. They're not quite democratic. They're Catholic. They don't really count as Christians. There's all that anti-Catholic feeling during this time. They seem rather effeminate, and they're semi-dark, just in terms of literal skin color and who gets to count as white. They're not Anglo-Saxon. Whereas Cuba, Philippines, a lot of this is just racially not true, but the United States believes it at the time. They think they're only ruled by tribes, completely ignoring people like Emilio Aguinaldo, the hero of the Philippines, who was their president at the time. They think they're barbaric, and they don't have any sort of religion, even though they've been Catholic for hundreds of years while under Spanish rule. They constantly are portrayed as childlike and feminine in a lot of these cartoons. So either childlike in the sense of, oh no, poor baby, you have to save you, or feminine in the sense of like, oh, help save me, brave sir. Like damsel in distress, women can't take care of themselves. There's a lot of sexism here too. So we got racism, we got sexism, we got some homophobia, some toxic masculinity. It's a fantastic mix of terribleness. So they also portray Cuba and the Filipinos as black and looking like they're Zulu Africans, even though they're nowhere like that. So just be aware of kind of some of these categories, and this is just one other way to characterize it in case that helps. So let's look at a couple of political cartoons coming from Judge and Puck magazine, some of my favorites, lavishly illustrated and fairly easy to decode sometimes. This one is making an economic argument because, notice, the Philippines are a stepping stone to China. Sure, they're going to bring education and religion in a way that's eerily similar to, remember that Manifest Destiny lady who's crossing the continent? Maybe you've seen that picture in your textbook or other places. When it's Colombia, she's carrying a school book and a telegraph wire. Similarly here, Uncle Sam wants to help the Chinese people, Uncle Sam representing the American people, want to help the Chinese with religion and education, but we also want to sell all of our stuff, the bridges, the railroads, the sewing machines. And again, this comes out of the Gilded Age. Our sweet, sweet industrial goods need some place to go. So they're portraying the Chinese man as opening us with open arms and saying they want all those things. So this is very much a pro-expansionist cartoon. This one as well, Uncle Sam is talking to McKinley. William McKinley was president during a lot of this imperialist adventure when it starts. McKinley, remember, is elected in 1896. He runs against William Jennings Bryan back then. He gets elected thanks to a lot of corporate donations, and you've maybe covered that if you've been talking about the Populist Party, etc. And notice there's American goods for foreign countries on some of these boats. The United States is taking over all of these areas and then hopefully making a canal for itself so that way they can trade all together. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but remember, the United States is going to get involved in the Spanish-American War, and they might be doing some of it for revenge, as you see it over here, but also for humanitarian purposes. So the United States feels like it has this compassion. It needs to save some people. And then I promised you that we were going to see some, unfortunately, racist cartoons here. So this one is talking about how the United States, as represented by Uncle Sam right here, needs to follow the example of John Bull, representing Britain, and it's taking care of its colonies. It's taking care of China and India, Siam, the Zulu, Egypt, people like that. And they're moving them from down here where it says things like oppression, barbarism, ignorance, vice, brutality, superstition, slavery, cannibalism, up towards civilization with, again, Lady Liberty with the Phrygian cap and liberty and education. So trying to educate these poor, helpless savages. And the United, I should say that in quotation marks, of course, and Uncle Sam is trying to bring Cuba, Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Hawaii up there as well. And then notice the title is called The White Man's Burden, after the famous Rudyard Kipling poem, where he talks about how we white men need to save the rest of the people. And unfortunately, it's a lot of work, but that's the white man's burden. So this idea of Uncle Sam needing to serve these people and having this super racist idea that they all look like Zulu Africans, that's coming out in a lot of these cartoons as well, unfortunately. The United States wants to help out, but it's blindfolded, it's tied up, it's not doing anything. We'll talk about why that is in just a second. But again, what I want to point out right here is that Cuba is portrayed as a child in need of help. So again, there's this infantilization. The Cubans are being shot by firing squad by the Spanish, and maybe we should get involved. They're mistreating people with barbarism, cruelty, assassination, and murder, and things like that. But the United States wants to get involved to be able to help them out sometimes. So let's take a quick pause. Once again, just a reminder, if you didn't hear it before or you need a reminder right now, if you have questions about some of this stuff as we're going along, I'm not covering all of period 7, obviously, just focusing on imperialism. But if you have some other questions that are related to how you might use this, how you can do some writing, other APUSH type questions, I teach APUSH all day, every day. So that's kind of my jam. So I can help you out there a little bit. Again, ask questions down below. See, we just got one that popped up. You can also add one to the chat as we go. Let's see. A-Dog asked a great question. Yeah, did yellow journalism contribute to this imperialism? Absolutely, yes. And do we have a definition for yellow journalism? It seems like you know what this is. Yellow journalism absolutely does contribute to this, especially with the Spanish-American War. We'll talk about the details there in just a second. But yellow journalism, in case people need some reminders of that, yellow journalism is deliberately exaggerating. It's making it sensationalized reporting. It's kind of like the clickbait of the 1890s. And so absolutely, the yellow journalist press were often very jingoistic, J-I-N-G-O, and then I-S-T-I-C. They were very, very warlike. They were excited about war. They were very nationalistic, and they were really excited about going to war. So yeah, they absolutely contribute to it, and we'll talk about the specifics about how they lead to the Spanish-American War in just a little bit. Thanks for the question, A-Dog. Fantastic, fantastic. If you got more, keep them coming. So let's look at a practice short answer question that you might see that would do a good job of summarizing some of the stuff we just talked about. So I'm going to allow you an opportunity to answer some of this as we go. So briefly describe one specific reason for U.S. expansion between 1890 and 1910. Gives you a nice 20-year window. It includes a lot of different events, some of which we'll cover in more detail in just a little bit. But given what we just covered, given what you know, what are some options for things that we could talk about for why the U.S. expands between 1890 and 1910? Go ahead and throw your answers into the chat over on the right-hand side of your screen. Meanwhile, as you're talking about that and as you're typing that, a couple of reminders about short answer questions. Remember, you have to do A, B, and C. We're just going to do one at a time here. Remember that you don't want to be writing a huge essay. You don't have a thesis. I'd say 2 to 3 sentences. Get to the point. Be specific. You want to drop some vocab. You want to define it. You want to tell me why I should care about that. And then you want to move the heck along because you don't have a ton of time. So A-Dog talks about nationalism and thinking we are helping them. Yeah, the we being the United States, the them being the people of Cuba, the Philippines, the places that we're colonizing. And remember, nationalism is this idea that my country is better than yours. It's sort of like hyper-patriotism, patriotism on steroids. That would certainly be one reason, yeah. If we have some others, go ahead and type those in. Again, you don't have to have a fully fleshed out 3 sentences. You can feel free to just throw in some quick vocab there into the chat, and then we can help expand that a little bit verbally as we go. Let's see, economic reasons, we need markets to sell our surplus of goods. Absolutely, absolutely. The United States is producing a ton of stuff thanks to the Gilded Age and market revolution. Manifest destiny, it's divine right to expand. Yes, yes. And I said manifest destiny, and you're not wrong either. I just want to make sure that we're all clarified and that I haven't messed you up too much. If it's in the 1840s and we're talking about Texas and westward expansion before the Mexican-American War, then, oh yeah, manifest destiny. This would be similar to manifest destiny. I'm not sure I use the phrase in the 1890s because that sort of drops off in usage. But did we think there was a divine calling? Oh, absolutely. There was still this idea of, well, McKinley's going to talk about falling on his knees in the White House at night and telling a bunch of ministers that, yeah, he felt God's calling to help uplift and Christianize the Filipinos. So yeah, there's definitely still a divine right to expand. It might not be called manifest destiny anymore, but it's very, very similar to that. Let me show you an example that I had. So the United States took over the Philippines, and I bolded some of the vocab words because you can just kind of see how I used them. After the Spanish-American War of 1898, Spanish-American War is also a vocab term, obviously, but talking about a specific place. So the U.S. wanted the Philippines to use as a stepping stone to China so they could sell their industrial goods in the Chinese economy. The Philippines provided a close coaling station, refueling point, and trade depot. So notice this is 3 sentences long. It's pretty short. It's to the point. It doesn't waste a lot of time. Does it give a reason for U.S. expansion? Absolutely. Talking about the economic factors and exactly what A-Dog was talking about, the seller surplus of goods. And it even says to China, and then why the Philippines is so useful. It mentions a specific place. That's always a good idea. Mention specifics if you can. All right, let's move on to our next section. So events and effects of imperialism. The Spanish-American War is going to be our first one. So there are some earlier events. There's events down in South America that involve the United States facing off with Great Britain. But, largely the Spanish-American War is going to be the first time we talk about imperialism outside the North American continent. Does Native American land confiscation count as imperialism? Absolutely. But the Spanish-American War in 1898 is kind of the first big event that we think of in period 7. So let's go through that a little bit. First of all, does anyone know the name of the ship that's in the upper right-hand corner picture? If you do, throw that into the chat. That's our bonus question of the day. Secondly, oh, A-Dog, you got it already. Spoiling it. Nice job. Yeah, that's the USS Maine, obviously before the incident, which we'll talk about in just a little bit. Maybe a slightly harder question, because it's not the familiar picture that we always see. Does anyone recognize that picture in the lower right-hand corner? Cadester22, nice job. I'm glad you were able to get that too. Doesn't matter if you're first on the test, right? You just need to get it right. So props to you too. The picture on the lower right-hand corner is going to be a famous one if it's zoomed in a little bit. And in the middle, we're going to have Teddy Roosevelt, and that's when his Rough Riders and some other people took over San Juan Heights. And it's after the U.S. defeated Cuba, partially. Yeah, they're taking over Cuba from the Spanish. So they're defeating the Spanish in Cuba. Not quite done yet, but they took over some Spanish positions. So let's talk about this. First, we have this idea of Cuba Libre. There is the Cuban Revolution against the Spanish. The Spanish have ruled Cuba ever since the times of Columbus, and yet Spain's empire is crumbling, and the Cubans are revolting because they want to be free and they want to be able to rule themselves. This is happening very close to the United States. So the United States is keeping a lot of eye on this. They want to make sure that their business interests are protected, and they don't like the humanitarian stuff that Spain's doing. Spain's doing some terrible stuff to the Cubans. So McKinley, the president at the time, sends the USS Maine, again, that's this ship over here, to Havana Harbor to check out the situation, to just monitor it. The Spanish welcome them. They even provide them with a berth, someplace to park the boat at night, and everything's going well until suddenly it blows up in the middle of the night. At the time, as already mentioned, the yellow journalism sort of whips the United States into a war fever. Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt says it's the work of the enemy, declares one of the headlines, and that's not actually true. It was probably an accident. There were other similar ships that had an unfortunate habit of storing the ammunition right next to the coal bunker and oven. So, conduction is the thing, and it gets heated in the tropical sun, and then it blows up. And so it's probably an accident. There were other accidents with similar ships. But either way, the United States blames Spain, and the official war motto, not really official, but the war motto after that becomes, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, and we're off to the Spanish-American War. So, couple places, you don't have to know all the military details of this, but Admiral George Dewey sails in the United States Pacific Fleet to Manila Bay, which is outside of the Philippines, and he destroys the Spanish Navy, thus conquering the Philippines, which kind of fall into the United States' lap. They weren't intending to do this, but when they go to war with Spain, they have to fight them wherever Spain is, and so they end up taking over the Philippines. There's also Emilio Aguinaldo. He was the president of the Philippines that the United States brought back to help defeat the Spanish, but then once the Spanish are gone, we don't really let him become in charge of his own country, and there's all sorts of tensions. We'll talk about that later. Teddy Roosevelt quits as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, joins the military as a volunteer, and runs his own regiment, essentially. And they help to take Kettle Hill, part of San Juan Heights. Although, if you'll notice, actually over here, we have a bunch of Buffalo soldiers. It's a little bit hard to see. You can probably see that gentleman right there. Buffalo soldiers, we're talking African Americans. They're the ones that actually get to the top first, and they kind of get pushed aside because Teddy Roosevelt wants the photo op with the flag in the center. This is unfortunately often the only part that you see right here that's cropped. So don't forget, African Americans, even though they're suffering a lot of discrimination and fighting in segregated units, still an important part of this war. The United States takes over Cuba, but it passes a couple of amendments, the Teller and the Platt Amendment. It's worth knowing a little bit of these. The Teller Amendment promises the United States is not going to colonize or take over Cuba. And yet the Platt Amendment says, Cuba, you can only really be free and we'll only withdraw our troops if you sign a treaty with us that grants us the authority to intervene in you whenever we want. And this is where the United States gets Guantanamo Bay, which we still have to this day. And that's where we hold some terrorists, right, in the sort of in-between stage. So there's all sorts of interesting legacies of imperialism that we're still talking about to this day. And then lastly, the United States takes over Hawaii on the way to the Philippines. Puerto Rico and Guam were also Spanish possessions that the United States takes over as a result of the war. The most important part that we're going to talk about later then with the aftermath is going to be the Filipino-American War and the debates overtaking the Philippines, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So that's the Spanish-American War itself. Next, the Filipino-American War. Let me pause right there. If you have questions, good time to ask. Want to make sure we're feeling okay on that. Spanish-American War, 1898, it's very, very short. Secretary of State John Hay famously calls it a splendid little war. And the United States takes over a bunch of Spanish territory, largely islands, including Cuba, which it will not keep as a colony, but will use and sort of economically imperialize it thanks to things like Bethlehem steel and cash crops that grow well in the tropical areas, sugar, etc. As mentioned earlier, the Filipinos do not like that the United States has taken over their country, and they want to be able to rule themselves. So when the United States insists on ruling over the Philippines, the Filipinos fight back, and there's the Philippine-American War. Technically, it lasts until about 1903 or so. Emilio Aguinaldo gets captured. There are hundreds of thousands of people that die, Filipino civilians and soldiers. The United States loses a couple thousand soldiers. It is a nasty, nasty war. And well, I'll get to this in just a little bit, but it's a nasty, nasty war where the United States eventually uses torture, what's known as the water cure, where we pump people full of salt water and then stomp on their stomachs to make them throw up. A lot of hit and run guerrilla tactics, a lot of massacres, things like that. So this is a nasty war. Imagine an earlier Vietnam almost. And that does not go well for the United States. A couple of cartoons about that. One of them is this one. It's up to them. Uncle Sam to the Filipinos says, you can take your choice. I have plenty of both. This lady right here in the, I guess, lavender, purple, not really sure. This lady represents a school teacher, right? It says school teacher on there. She's trying to educate them. This is Uncle Sam saying to the Filipinos, hey, embrace our Western education and civilization style or face the wrath of the U.S. military. This gentleman right here representing the military and sort of the Bible or the bullet, the books or the bullet. Channeling a little bit of Malcolm X there, I guess. But the Uncle Sam is offering the choice, and he's saying, please humbly accept my offer of education. Now, the Filipinos, one of whom kind of looks like Aguinaldo a little bit, they're not so sure. Some of them are portrayed as rather primitive and primal looking in the sense of the United States. They're not happy about this, and so they're not going to choose necessarily the school teacher right away, and that's going to lead to all sorts of fighting. There is also then China and the open door notes. So after the United States gets access to the Philippines, it's then very close to China, which it wants to trade. It wants to sell them goods. It wants to be able to use the Philippines as a staging ground, a refueling point, an entrepot, what have you. And Secretary of State, again, Hay, says to all the European powers, hey, this is the time when European powers are carving up China, taking what are called spheres of influence. But you know what? You need to leave room for the United States and free trade. You have to let China be independent. You have to let them trade with the United States. So keep the door open, so to speak. And there are a bunch of cartoons you could see about open door. I just gave you this one. Uncle Sam here is talking to the rest of the Europeans. So you got Germans and Italians, English, Russians, Austrians, and French, and they're all carving up parts of China, and they all want it for themselves. Uncle Sam says, okay, you can carve up some of this, but you need to make sure that Uncle Sam has his own ability to trade with China. So just be aware the United States gets very involved with Asia after the Philippines, especially with China, thanks to trade. Then two more things, both of which come after the Filipino-American War. Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, not Theodore, becomes a war hero after the Spanish-American War, and he becomes vice president to McKinley. When McKinley gets assassinated, Roosevelt takes over and becomes the U.S. president. He issues what is called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Let me show you what this means. Remember the Monroe Doctrine, which was issued in 1823 by James Monroe, tells Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. It declares the Western Hemisphere, aka all the Americas, closed to any further European colonization. The U.S. considers that to be their backyard and their place to be in charge. Well, the Roosevelt Corollary adds a little bit to that. It says, Europe, stay out because the United States has the authority to go in. It's almost like a Platt Amendment, but for all of Latin America. Basically, if the United States doesn't want Europe to get involved, to be able to come over here and say, hey, Cuba hasn't paid their debt, we're going to take over now and get them to pay their debt. The United States says, no, don't worry, we'll handle it. We have the right to go in to any place in Latin America, because if they mess up too much, then Europe might want to come and take it over. We don't want that. So we're going to be in charge. They didn't ask anybody in Latin America, of course, but this is the United States declaring it to be so. It's kind of like the Monroe Doctrine. So in this cartoon, Teddy Roosevelt, wearing his Rough Riders uniform, is telling Europe to keep their hands off of Santo Domingo, otherwise known as nowadays Dominican Republic and Haiti. Then you also get something called dollar diplomacy. That's another version of imperialism. Dollar diplomacy comes with the person who was after Teddy Roosevelt, and that would be William Howard Taft. Let's see. A-Dog asked a good question. You were saying, is this when the United States forces Japan to trade? Japan is trading with the United States, and we're continuing to be interested in this. When the United States forces Japan to open, that's in the 1850s with Commodore Matthew Perry. And so that's going to be before the Civil War. So the United States has been interested in trading with Asia for a long time. This is just going to be going into China even more, although continuing to trade with Japan. Yeah, great question. Great question. So the United States has been interested in Asia for a while, and they're going to continue to be so. Dollar diplomacy, again, like I said, comes from after McKinley comes Roosevelt. After Roosevelt comes Taft. Taft comes up with this policy known as dollar diplomacy. And dollar diplomacy, even though this is Teddy Roosevelt, you'll get the idea here. Notice it says debt collector right here and the sheriff. And this is the big stick. Teddy Roosevelt famously says, speak softly and carry a big stick, a.k.a. be willing to negotiate, but be ready to hammer them if they really need it. Dollar diplomacy says, look, American companies, you can go invest in Latin America. You can invest anywhere in the Caribbean, and we will back you up with a strong military. So dollar diplomacy says the United States is going to spread its influence, its economy, and it's backed up by the full faith and credit and military of the United States. So those are just a few things that are worth knowing. Again, we'll cover the next president, Woodrow Wilson, later when we talk about World War I. All right, our next practice short answer question that you can answer in the chat. Feel free to add some things there. Describe a consequence of U.S. expansion during the same time period, 1890 to 1910. I kept this one really broad, but to give you a lot of options, but I think it's a good question that they could expect you to know. A specific consequence of U.S. expansionism. I'm going to relax here a little bit, crack my back, give you the opportunity to answer something in the chat. What sort of consequences of U.S. expansion are going to happen between 1890 and 1910? Go ahead and throw those in the chat. Reminder, if you're looking for ways to answer SAQs well, there's that ACE acronym that some people find very helpful. The answer, cite, explain, answer. Well, give an answer that makes sense and answers the prompt directly. Cite some specific evidence that you can use, and then explain. Tell us why it answers the question, why we should care, etc. Let's see. Increased trade with Asia is going to be a consequence. Absolutely. Nice job, A-Dog. Be nice if we had a B dog too and a C dog. Just kept going through the alphabet. Sorry, terrible joke. Yeah, increased trade with Asia is going to be a consequence. A lot of these wars are going to be a consequence as well. Let's see. I think that was the one that I used, actually. I talked about the Filipino-American War, too. So this is what I said. I said the Filipinos did not appreciate swapping Spanish hegemony for U.S. colonization. Decreased isolationism is also a good answer. Gaddister22, nice job. Yeah, so the Filipinos did not appreciate swapping Spanish rule for U.S. colonialism after the U.S. claimed the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. Filipinos wanted independence. Under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, many Filipinos resisted U.S. imperialism with force in a conflict called the Filipino-American War. The war lasted for many years. You can also call it the War of Philippine Independence or Philippine Revolutionary War, sort of. It resulted in hundreds of thousands of Philippine deaths, thousands of U.S. casualties, and the Philippines stayed under the U.S. control until World War II. Again, this is me writing, and so I threw in as many options and examples as I possibly could. You don't necessarily have to write that way, but writing in a way that's compact, that's succinct, that's to the point, that answers the question, that gives them defined vocab words is a really good idea. You want to give them absolutely tons of reasons to give you this point. Because remember, short answer questions are all or nothing, 0 or 1. So don't make them go, oh, I don't know if they know what they're talking about. Overwhelm them with evidence in a short, succinct, compact, punchy way. And that way, it would be hard for them not to give you the points, right? All right. So we've talked about why the U.S. wants to expand. We've talked about how the U.S. expanded and where. Now we're going to talk about some additional consequences of this, some debates. That's Teddy Roosevelt in his Rough Riders uniform, by the way. So there's going to be some pro-imperialists. Some pro-imperialists are business leaders, government leaders. Examples would be Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, Josiah Strong, etc. If you see any of those gentlemen talking, they're probably in favor of imperialism, and that's going to be a big deal for us. But there's also a strong, although outnumbered and numerically not as large, anti-imperialist group in the United States. They call themselves, rather creatively, the Anti-Imperialist League. And there might be some famous examples of those people. That would be Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, other people. Henry James is the person I was thinking of. There's other intellectuals who are a part of this campaign, and they don't think the United States should be spreading overseas. We kind of talked about the pro-imperialists and what their theory is and why they support this. So let's talk a little bit more about the anti-imperialists. Well, one, you can look at this cartoon. This is very much an anti-imperialist cartoon because they feel like the United States is getting overwhelmed by taking over too many territories too quickly. Again, notice the patronization, the, oh, poor little, like super not cool and unflattering and patronizing toward the people that the United States is taking over, portraying them all as children, Hawaii as black for some reason, the rest of them looking fairly white in interesting ways, but again, portrayed as children, not as fully formed adults. Contrast it with this one. There are some people that thought the United States fought for good things. Notice the before picture. This is a before and after picture. Before the United States intervened on behalf of these oppressed peoples, they were all oppressed under a yoke. They didn't know what they were doing. They were really burdened. And then after the United States rescued them from their oppression, they all dressed like Western people, like American businessmen. They even have cigars, top hats, three-piece suits, etc. This is very clearly a pro-imperialism cartoon. Now, I want to ask you about this cartoon. We actually discussed this today in my APUSH class, and it was kind of an interesting way to look at it. Because students sometimes struggle with this. Is this a pro or anti-imperialist cartoon? It's hard to tell. It says 10,000 miles from tip to tip. Is it a good thing? If you could go ahead and throw into the chat, do you think it's a plus or a minus? Thumbs up, thumbs down, pro-imperialist, anti-imperialist? Just go ahead. Let's take a quick vote there. What do you think? Ronald says anti-imperialist. Okay. It's hard to know. I find it sometimes helpful to contrast it with another one. A-Dog says pro-imperialist. Oh, man, it's a split decision already. Maybe this will help you a little bit. Here's a different cartoon. Similar situation, though. It's called His 128th birthday. Gee, but this is an awful stretch. This is an anti-imperialist cartoon because the United States has taken over Puerto Rico, Panama, Cuba, etc. But notice how far away are the Philippines? They're just so far. It's called a stretch. Going back to this cartoon, does it look like the eagle is stretching beyond what it can bear? I don't think so. And also looks like 1798, aka 100 years ago, the United States is pretty small. Now it's grown a whole bunch bigger. The sun is rising behind the United States. There's the stars representing the states, sure, but there's also the rising sun of American empire, kind of like what we saw in the Manifest Destiny painting again, light symbolizing civilization and its inevitability. And so the United States is taking over a bunch of these territories, and the eagle does kind of look like a vulture a little bit. Yeah. It's not the best. But Ronald, yeah, if this was a vulture, that'd be an anti-imperialist cartoon. Can totally see where you're tracking there. Yeah. This is an American eagle symbolizing the United States, right? And this one is pro, but it's not super clear, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. But again, there's a bit of a debate. Pro-imperialists say, hey, we're getting bigger, stronger as a country. Anti-imperialists say, do we really have any business governing people that are so far away? Couple of other reasons. I want to go back to just talking about the anti-imperialists. They are going to oppose expansion for what they consider to be hypocritical reasons for expansion. They say the U.S. used to be a colony. How can we take colonies? That's entirely hypocritical. It makes no sense. And plus, these people are not giving their consent to be governed. The Filipinos are saying, we don't want you here. And the United States, of all nations, should certainly know that you're not supposed to govern people without their consent. I mean, there's some taxation without representation illusions here. They're also going to be against imperialism, the Anti-Imperialist League people will be, for racist reasons. Much like when the United States takes over parts of Mexico with the Mexican-American War, the United States only takes the part at the top of Mexico that doesn't have a whole lot of people but has a lot of resources because we don't want brown people in the United States voting, which territories become states, become places with voters. There are some anti-imperialists who say don't take over territory like the Philippines or Guam or Puerto Rico because there's too many brown people there and they're going to vote, and we all know that brown people can't vote, right? So there's all this stupid racist nonsense as well. And by the way, you probably know this too, but the United States still holds a lot of these places, not the Philippines, not Cuba, but Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, places like that. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. And actually, this came up a little bit ago because of the hurricane, that we should still, keep them in our thoughts and prayers. But the Puerto Rican hurricane was a huge deal because they are American citizens. There's over 4 million American citizens on Puerto Rico. That's more than many American states. And yet they seemingly have fewer rights because of something called the insular cases, where the Supreme Court decided that they needed to be dependent children, like we've seen in a lot of these cartoons. It's supposed to be temporary, and it still exists. Awkward. So keep in mind that some of these effects are going to be racist. Some of the arguments for and against are going to be racist, but some of the effects are honestly still pretty racist, which is pretty sad. Lastly, some of them are going to oppose this because of the cost or because they just don't think the United States should be taking colonies in general. But these voices largely get drowned out. Everyone who is in the military or in government or in the press tends to be pro-imperialist, and they overwhelm these people that are against it. So another short answer question for you, that'd be this one. Describe specific ways Americans debated over imperialism between 1890 and 1910. I'll give you a little bit of time to write some stuff in the chat box. Otherwise, you can also take a look at this one. People like anti-imperialists like Mark Twain formed the Anti-Imperialist League to oppose the U.S.'s annexation of the Philippines, and pro-imperialists who wanted those islands for coaling stations, see the answer to letter A. Some argue the United States as a former colony could not conquer other people without their consent, echoing patriot critique of the British in the 1700s. Others used racism, arguing that non-white people were incapable of citizenship and thus would pollute the U.S. Republic, so the United States should not take over these territories. So, man, we got a lot of different options there. I kind of gave you 3 of those. Consent, colonization, racism, all that kind of stuff. But, excuse me. Guess it's been a long week. You should be able to answer this with a variety of answers. both in terms of pro and anti-imperialists. We covered a lot of pro ones earlier, so now we can add some anti-imperialist stuff. So let's add a little bit of a PS to World War I. Again, we're going to be covering more of World War I later in a subsequent stream, but I figured we'd give you a quick introduction, at least as it pertains to imperialism. First of all, you need to know that World War I begins in 1914, but the United States does not join until 1917. So knowing some of those dates would be pretty important. World War I begins, especially if you've taken world history, you already know this. World War I begins in Europe, and there's a famous acronym called MANIA, and we'll talk about some of that stuff. MANIA is an acronym that stands for militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and assassination. World War I is partially caused by imperialism because all of these European countries want to expand all over the place, and if everyone wants to expand, everyone wants land. At a certain point, there's going to be no more land to take over without taking over a European colony, and there's going to be competition for colonies. So imperialism is going to cause, also it's wrapped up in nationalism, right? My country's better than your country. I deserve to take over more than you do. And so World War I is going to be sort of the time when a lot of Americans begin to realize, man, this imperialism stuff kind of has some downsides. Plus, by this point, the United States, by 1914, has gotten involved in many other countries. Think our interventions in Cuba, and not only this, we take over Cuba a couple more times. We take over all sorts of countries in Central America. We intervene in Mexico. We intervene all over Latin America in ways that are actually still profoundly affecting us today, because it's why a lot of those places struggle a lot and why they want to come to the United States, and immigration issues and why there's so much violence. The United States kind of messed them up a little bit. So the United States is very much involved in other countries, although we don't want to go over into the Eastern Hemisphere or into Europe. We're definitely involved in the Western Hemisphere and Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt Corollary. So Woodrow Wilson is a progressive president. Remember, he's first elected in 1912 during the three-way race between him and Roosevelt and Taft. He wins the presidency. He's a Democrat, but he's also a progressive. Everyone claims to be a progressive at that point, right? And he believes in imperialism. He does some interventions that we just mentioned in a lot of different areas. And we stay neutral in World War I, for the first couple of years, but then we get involved. U.S. trade plays a role in why we get involved. And we'll talk about this more again next week. But U.S. trade, the United States wants to trade with the Central Powers and with the Allies, although vastly more trade goes toward the Allies. That's going to be England and France. And some of those ships get sunk by German U-boats. And the United States insists upon its right to neutrally trade with all these different countries. Think almost like quasi-war or War of 1812, where we're getting hit from both sides, but one side worse than the other. So U.S. trade, coaling stations, the fact that we have colonies overseas makes us more likely to get involved as well. Then, when we do get involved in the war, thanks to things like the Lusitania, the Sussex Pledge, the Zimmermann Telegram, Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, all of those things, Woodrow Wilson claims that we are getting involved in the war to make the world safe for democracy. And making the world safe for democracy sounds a whole heck of a lot like what we talked about at the beginning of the stream, why the United States wants to expand and take over. The United States feels that it's the best leader. It's the most democratic. It's the most courageous and Christian, and it's able to be an arbitrator. One of the reasons Wilson actually wanted to stay out initially is so that the United States could arbitrate this debate, but eventually it realizes it needs to wade in, show them how it's done, and turned out to cost a lot of lives. But the United States is able then to form some of the peace treaty stuff that goes on with the Treaty of Versailles later. So U.S. imperialism means that we're going to get involved, and some of the same reasons for why we do get involved. Lastly, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends World War I. And at the Treaty of Versailles, which you'll, again, talk about a little bit later, the Allied powers decided to set up the League of Nations in order to make sure that a world war like this doesn't happen again. Spoiler alert, they failed because it's called World War I, not the World War. So they try to set up the League of Nations. The United States refuses to join. The Senate refuses to ratify this, led by Henry Cabot Lodge and his irreconcilables, who say, no, the United States can't give up its power to declare war. Because the idea behind the League of Nations is that if any country is being aggressive and trying to take over some territory, all other countries in the league need to gang up on it and have to declare war on it. Well, the United States didn't want to give up its authority and power to declare war on its own, so it's one of the reasons the United States doesn't join. But the League of Nations is important for imperialism because it takes away Germany's colonies, because Germany loses, and allows Britain and France to keep some of theirs, and the United States keeps its colonies too. So the United States is more likely to get involved because of imperialism, and it becomes involved because of imperialism, and the aftermath also benefits U.S. imperialism as well. So, questions about World War I that we should be familiar with. We've got a few more minutes left. Want to make sure that if you have questions or things like that, I can help to answer some of those. So, questions, concerns, things that you would like me to answer that you can add to the Ask a Question down below. You can add to the chat, a variety of places. While we're thinking about questions that we might have, let me go back through this slideshow to the beginning a second, just so that way we can review what we've talked about and I can make sure that we're all on the same page. Here we go. So we had the reasons for imperialism. You need to be able to compare and contrast the imperialism of the 1890s with the imperialism of earlier times, think Manifest Destiny, and honestly imperialism of later times with the United States taking over things during the Cold War, but you probably haven't covered that yet, so you can't do that yet. You should be aware of events and effects of imperialism. So you need to be aware of the Spanish-American War. Not all of the military details, but certainly the things that are important for where it happens, why it happens, the yellow journalism that people mentioned, and all the reasons for imperialism that then get concrete and get actually put into a specific purpose during the Spanish-American War. You need to be aware of the Filipino-American War, things like the Roosevelt Corollary, the Open Door Note, dollar diplomacy, etc. And then be aware of debates over imperialism. This does not happen quietly. In fact, almost all the debate happens over should the United States take over the Philippines. That's a big deal. And then you should know some stuff about World War I also. So especially be aware of how it ties in with progressivism and how it deals with imperialism. Let's see. A-Dog asked a great question again, saying, what was the women's rights movement doing at this time? How did imperialism and World War I affect it? Great question. So this is the height of progressivism. This is the height of the women's rights movement. So we have people like Alice Paul and Susan B. Anthony, and they're all fighting for women's rights, largely women's right to vote. In the 1920s, we're going to get Margaret Sanger, etc., so not quite yet. But they're fighting for the right to vote. This will eventually lead to the 19th Amendment getting passed in 1920. But there's a lot of protesting that happens during World War I. So while not directly tied in with imperialism, I think one could definitely see some parallels here where the progressives want to be able to put experts in charge, right? They want to have expert rule overseas. They also want to have more democracy at home. And yet it seems pretty hypocritical that are not doing more democracy overseas. But that's because they want experts in charge, and they think the United States white people, especially men, are in charge. Women usually are not quite as jingoistic, not quite as military gung-ho for military stuff. But I honestly don't know a whole lot of concrete examples of connections between the women's rights movement and imperialism. There is that sort of masculinity, toxic masculinity that we talked about with the frontier, but that's not really women's rights movement necessarily. In terms of World War I, Alice Paul and some of her cohorts, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA, they begin to picket the White House during World War I. They say, hey, one of the reasons Woodrow Wilson says we're going to war is because the Germans aren't able to have their own ruling. They're ruled by this Kaiser dictator guy, and they're taking over other countries too that aren't able to rule themselves. So we should do something about this. And yet, wait a minute, back home in the United States, aren't there people that are taxed and not represented in government, even though they're citizens? Oh yeah, that's right, half the population with women. So they picket outside the White House, and as you probably are aware, picketing during wartime is considered really controversial, right? Partly because it's considered anti-patriotic, perhaps, unpatriotic, or anti-American. They do it anyway. They go to jail. There's force feeding. There's even a famous picture that you might see somewhere of a lady holding up a sign that says, President Wilson, hundreds of thousands of you say we're going to war to help Germans vote. but hundreds of thousands of women have no right to vote. Take the plank out of your own eye, using that biblical illusion of, why do you care about the speck of sawdust in your neighbor's eye, but you can't see the plank in your own eye? So, hey, Woodrow Wilson, stop being a hypocrite. Help out the Germans and help out the women here at home that can't vote. That's a big part of it too. Yeah, good question. This isn't necessarily the question that you just related to the question you just asked, but it kind of reminded me of this. Keep in mind that the racism that we're seeing with imperialism is also connected with the racism back at home, right? I mentioned that the Spanish-American War is happening 2 years after Plessy v. Ferguson. There's also people that go overseas and unfortunately they say terrible, terrible things. Like there are soldiers that go to the Philippines because they want to shoot N-words and things like that, which is pretty terrible. But also be aware that there are some new opportunities here. So we mentioned the Buffalo soldiers that fight in the Spanish-American War. There are other African Americans that are going to be serving during this time. And even though they're dealing with segregation and segregated units, they're able to do some more fighting, do some more production. Back home during World War I, there's a lot of African Americans that start moving north during World War I for factory jobs. That's eventually known as the Great Migration. So you should be aware of some of those things too. All right, looks like we're about ready to wrap up here. If you have more questions, now would be the time to ask them. Couple of reminders. If you want to look on the 5 website, you can link to all the previous FRQs that the AP U.S. History exam has covered before. U.S. imperialism has been a previous year topic, so it's probably not going to be another topic this year, but you never know. They might repeat themselves, and it's certainly worth a practice because now that you know everything about imperialism, you can start to think about, oh, I can make this into a DBQ, I can make this into an LEQ. It could be a short answer question, and it probably will be a few stimulus-based multiple choice questions as well. So let me go toward the end and make sure that we've covered all of your questions, your concerns. I think you folks are fantastic. Thanks for sticking with me tonight. Thanks for learning some more about imperialism. Thanks for being active in the chat sometimes too and asking some great questions. If you folks have more questions, we'll be here. Remember, 5 has its own support system in a variety of ways, but also these live streams on Thursday night are a fantastic way to be able to catch up and get some new information perhaps or some reviews depending on how you're going to use them. All right. Well, I hope you folks have a fantastic night. You can do it. Thank you again as well, and have a good night too. Bye.